Now arriving at Thomastown.
Welcome to This Thomo Life, proudly brought to you by Yarra Plenty Regional Libraries, Thomastown branch. On today's program, we have Robert Wuchatsch, a Thomastown historian. In the 1850s, German settlers came to Thomastown. Some of those German settlers were Robert's great-grandparents.
My name is Rob Wuchatsch. I was born in 1950 and I grew up in Thomastown. I lived here until 1974. Then I moved away to Greensborough and Montmorency, and I came back in 1986 and I lived here again until 2006, until I moved down to Western Victoria. My family have been here in Thomastown since 1850, so we've been here a long time. They were part of a group of German immigrants who came to Victoria in 1850 and settled at Thomastown in March 1850. At that stage, it wasn't known as Thomastown, and in fact we were still part of New South Wales. And the area was known as Keilbundora, which was the parish name for this area. And then it was called Dry Creek, which was what the Edgars Creek was known as then. And then it had a number of names, Neu-Mecklenburg, which was where some of the Germans had come from. But then it became known as Westgarthtown, and it was known as Westgarthtown right through until the early 1900s. The Germans built their houses out of stone. They built a bluestone church. There's a cemetery there, and thankfully some of those houses and the cemetery and the church still survive.
Westgarthtown is Thomastown, and Thomastown is Westgarthtown, built on migrants.
Westgarthtown got it's named after William Westgarth, in honour of William Westgarth, and he was a Scottish merchant, historian. He was a politician. He arrived in Victoria, when it was Port Phillip then, Port Phillip district of New South Wales, and he was one of the people who was here who said we need to have German settlers in Victoria, because he'd seen them in South Australia and he thought they would be useful additions, and because they were good at growing vegetables and wine, and they were hard-working. They were seen as hard-working. So he encouraged Germans to come to Victoria. They were coming to South Australia, but not Victoria. And he he spoke with the British government and got some financial assistance for some of the Germans to come to sponsor them. And when they came, he also helped them when they arrived, and he in particular helped the Germans who settled here at Thomastown. And they were all German speakers. They couldn't understand the language or the laws, and even if they couldn't speak English. They couldn't speak English, so they had to have somebody to help them. And they needed to be naturalised before they could own land. So he and a colleague named Carr purchased land on their behalf with their money and then allocated it all to them. So they bought 640 acres, which includes this where we are here today at the Thomastown Library. That was part of one of the German farms, and transferred it to them. And because of the help that he gave them, the settlers decided to call their village Westgarthtown. Westgarth in Northcote is totally separate. It was named after him, but only because there was a street named after him in Northcote called Westgarth Street. And when the government put a railway through in 1889 or so, they put a station on Westgarth Street and called it Westgarth Street Station. And then gradually over the years, the area that's in the locality is assumed the name Westgarth, but they're both connected to the same man, but there's no connection between Westgarth in Northcote and Westgarthtown in Thomastown, other than people get confused by it all.
What was 1950s Thomastown like?
Well, I lived here at Westgarthtown from when I was born in Regent. And my first memories, I guess, were when I was 3 or 4 years old, and you would walk with my mother. We'd have to go. If we went into the city, we'd go by train, and the electric train only came out to Thomastown. So we would have to walk to Thomastown Station along the dirt roads down what's now Gardenia Road, and then along past the cemetery and over the bridge, and then down Mountford Road and down Main Street and get to the station. And I was always intrigued by the bluestone buildings, the walls, the buildings, the cemetery, the graves there, and most of my ancestors are all laid out in that cemetery, for me to see, and that's where I'll end up being buried, in some time in the future. But it just seemed interesting, and it was unlike any other place you went. There weren't many bluestone houses around to see, and the architecture was unusual. They were not the same as some of the other bluestone houses you'd see. They were all they were homemade. That's what made them different, and they also had some German building styles. Not that I was aware of then. They just looked different to me. But there were dairy farms, and it was just an interesting place to grow up.
So what's the first thing you do when you get up? You go make breakfast. Big bowl of cornflakes or cereal or whatnot. What do you use? Milk? There's a very good chance you've used pure milk.
Westgarthtown's economy had been based on dairying since the 1850s, and they found that they were close enough to Melbourne that they could produce their milk and get it in a short enough time so that if it was fresh milk it didn't go off. It was all taken in on wagons in the middle of the night, and they could also produce butter and cheese and sell it in Melbourne or the suburbs. In the suburbs then, though, probably only in the very earliest days, only came out to Collingwood and Fitzroy. But then over the next 100 years or so, and dairying continued at Westgarthtown right up until 1971, and the Zabel family were the last family to dairy. My father sold the cows back in the 1930s, and other farmers milked up until the 50s or early 60s. One of the families, Siebel, Albert Siebel, was a bloke with a bit of get up and go, and he was my father's cousin. And there were three Proposh girls, all married three boys from Westgarthtown. One married a Gritzner, one married a Siebel, and one married a Wuchatsch, and that was my grandmother. And Albert, during the Depression in the 1930s, the price for milk was poor, and the dairies in the city or the suburbs would say, "Oh no, we can get milk." To the farmers, they'd say, "We can get milk a halfpenny, a gallon cheaper from someone else," and they'd be trying to get them to cut their prices. And he said, "Look, why don't we sell our own milk and try and make get more money?" So Albert went around to all the different farmers at Westgarthtown, and including my father, and said, "How about you supply me and I'll buy a dairy and we'll do it ourselves." So he did that, and he bought a dairy in Preston, and it was a dairy owned by a man named Kruger, but he decided to come up with a new name, and he actually coined the term pure milk. And his dairy did all right, and he was a member of the Metropolitan Dairies, sort of the Farmers Producers sort of association, and so they said, "Oh, why don't we do this on a bigger scale?" So the dairy producers in Melbourne, the Metropolitan Dairy Producers, formed a company called Metropolitan Dairies, bought his business, including the Pura name, and they gradually expanded through the 1940s, and in about 1949 they merged with the dairy, Ivybank Dairy, which was down in Northcote or Thornbury, and from there they were pretty progressive people as well, and Albert was on the board, Albert Siebel, and they gradually grew, so they got to the stage where they were supplying 60-70% of Victoria's milk, and then they eventually became, as we all know, Pura is a national brand name, and the company itself changed its name. My father always had shares in them, and so I always knew what was happening, and they changed their name to Consolidated Foods in, I think, the late 60s, and then they were bought out by Gadsden's, who was supplying all the packaging for the milk, and then they became National Foods, and then they were bought by San Miguel Brewery or something, which was owned by Kirin in Japan. So now it's part of Lion Nathan, owns the Pura Milk brand name, and it's owned by Mitsubishi, or Kirin, which is owned by Mitsubishi in Japan. So from being a small cooperative venture that was designed to be Australian-owned, locally owned, and to benefit the producers, it's now become a large company owned by offshore. The Pura Dairy was established in 1934.